come too.
Hi there. Rather than a review, this video is more of a critique or post-mortem of the Phantom Pain. I'll be examining the whole game start to finish. It has been quite a while, so it shouldn't be much of an issue anymore, but there will be spoilers for this game and the other mainline games. I suggest you play through all of them before watching this. Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain released worldwide on September 15th, 2015, and follows punished Venom Snake in his struggle to build a new military organization and foil the plans of Skullface. To say it was one of the year's most anticipated games would be an understatement. On release, it received a ton of critical acclaim, with many reviewers giving it perfect scores and calling it hands down the best game in the series. Playing The Phantom Pain when it came out last year left me with mixed feelings, more so than any other Metal Gear game, so I decided to wait some time before revisiting it. The game begins with Snake awakening from his 9-year coma after the events of the Ground Zeroes prequel, only to learn that his left arm is gone and there's irremovable shrapnel lodged near his brain and heart. To make matters worse, the hospital comes under fire almost immediately. Despite the doctors doing everything they can to reduce his muscle atrophy, Snake is nearly incapable of defending himself and has to rely on a mysterious man who refers to himself as Ishmael. This lends itself to a tutorial perfectly, since it makes logical sense that someone in a coma for that long would need to relearn how to function normally. I think the most interesting aspect of the prologue is the way it uses horror elements to create tension. Over the years, players have grown accustomed to tutorials being places of safety where they can learn the ropes without fear of reprisal. It makes sense that most games work like this because it would be awfully unfair to punish the player before they know the controls at a minimum, but it comes at the cost of tension early on. The actual gameplay in the hospital is so simplistic that it's almost impossible to fail, yet Snake's vulnerability and fear of being hunted down by the soldiers or the supernatural man on fire keeps the escape engaging. Furthermore, Snake's progression from crawling to limping to moving normally feels satisfying. It's as if he's learning along with the player. There's one section of the prologue in particular that I want to bring attention to, the part where Snake and Ishmael duck into a room with many curtained cubicles. Unfortunately for the two of them, an enemy soldier is already present, and he begins to methodically pull back each curtain one by one, executing anyone behind it. In my first playthrough, I thought this room was fantastic. Some of the best situations in video games are those where environmental context by itself informs the player's actions. Without a single word being uttered, the player can intuitively figure out that Snake should be safe if he crawls into a cubicle that had already been visited while the guard's back is turned. Later on, I replayed the prologue to see what would happen if Snake remained in the cubicle with Ishmael, and I was disappointed to find out that simply being near him keeps Snake completely safe. You don't even have to hide under the nearby bed. Maybe I'm in the minority in how I approach this, and maybe it wasn't even meant to be a stealth tutorial, but if that's the case, the team might have unintentionally made a room that teaches how line of sight works. It's a minor gripe, especially in the prologue, but I wish the game respected the player's intelligence enough to let them hide on their own, instead of using a cutscene to yank control away and keep them unharmed. Eventually, Snake meets up with his old enemy-turned-friend, Revolver Ocelot, and the two of them finally manage to escape after a horseback shootout with the man on fire. The prologue works well as a hook because it raises so many questions. Who is Ishmael? Why is Psycho Mantis here? What is the relationship between the soldiers and the man on fire, and why is he even after Snake in the first place? Is the man on fire even a real person? It's a long time before these questions are answered, but it's more than enough motivation for veterans and starting players alike. Once the duo arrives in Afghanistan, they prepare to rescue Snake's old friend, Kazuhira Miller, so that they can establish a second private military company together. There's one more tutorial introducing the iDroid, a device that manages both the map and any resources Snake acquires, as well as the InScope, a device that's a pair of binoculars. What follows is one of my favorite parts of the entire game. After everything that's transpired so far, the revelation of the 9-year coma, the attack on the hospital, the tutorials, the game finally hands the player the reins and says,
"Now go! Let the legend come back to life."
Snake is given a waypoint that leads to information on which building Miller is being held captive in, but the player doesn't even have to pursue that at all, and with a generous 3-day time limit, there's plenty of time to experiment. Before I get into talking about the controls, I should mention that I played my PC copy with an Xbox 360 controller as opposed to with the mouse and keyboard. Since I played all the other games with a controller, I felt that I may as well keep with tradition in this case, so I'll be talking about it from that perspective and using the default controller settings. The control scheme for Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain is drastically different from prior installments in the series, with arguably the biggest change being the removal of weapon and item lists in favor of radial menus. Instead of holding down the shoulder buttons and scrolling through every available option, the player holds down a direction on the D-pad to bring up a category, and then uses the right analog stick to make their decision. Combined with 4 equip categories instead of the classic 2, swapping equipment is much less time-consuming than in the previous games. Since the old lists are gone, switching between weapons and items no longer pauses the game like it did in previous titles. This is extremely welcome. I think people underestimate just how much accessing the old menus to cycle through items killed the momentum of the gameplay. The old inventory system was iconic, but dividing every equipable item into 2 lists so large the game has to pause to let the player scroll through them never seemed like a graceful mechanic. Above all, the system is fluid, and tasks that would be a nightmare in other games like calling D-Horse while sprinting are incredibly intuitive in this game. The camouflage system introduced by MGS3 is still present in the Phantom Pain, yet there's less information on it than ever before. Like in previous games, Snake's clothing relative to the environment he's in has an effect on how easily guards can see him, but there's almost nothing to indicate how effective his camouflage is in any given situation. MGS 3 and 4 used a camo index number to tell the player how well Snake blends into the terrain, but the system was greatly altered in Peace Walker. In that game, the player could only adjust Snake's camo before missions, so showing a number during gameplay would have been useless most of the time. Instead, the camo selection screen displays letter grades corresponding to how a particular outfit will blend in with each area. MGS 5 removed this feature with nothing to compensate for it. The only information the player has available to them is the description for each individual pattern that states the type of terrain it's intended for. Just saying, "This blends in with rocks," sounds like something my Dragon's Dogma pawn would say. It doesn't tell the player how well it functions in other areas or even how effective camouflage is to begin with. Furthermore, the game's night cycle introduces even more questions. Does the black sneaking suit at night provide a higher camo index than the appropriate pattern for the terrain? Does a guard's impaired vision in the dark make camo irrelevant to begin with? I have no idea, there's no way to be sure without more information. Peace Walker's camo ratings would have worked perfectly in the Phantom Pain, so I really don't understand why that system was removed. As Metal Gear Solid 5 is the first open-world game in the series, many of the core stealth mechanics have changed to accommodate the fact that players are unlikely to infiltrate a given area the same way. Instead of a mini-map with the location of guards in their fields of vision, Snake marks enemies he sees through his binoculars. Marked enemies are permanently highlighted and are displayed on Snake's iDroid map. Targets are visible through walls and other obstacles, and soldiers remain highlighted even if Snake is killed or restarts from a checkpoint. This is an insanely powerful tool, but it takes time to use and is more interactive than the Soliton radar ever was. The skill ceiling for marking isn't exactly high, but a hasty player can find themselves in trouble later on if they aren't thorough and end up missing a guard. There's a certain satisfaction that comes with surveying a base and planning your own infiltration route that fits in very well with the Metal Gear series, especially as Snake's arsenal grows over the course of the game. I think this sort of freedom is the greatest advantage of the open world and the Phantom Pain's most polished aspect. Reflex mode, on the other hand, seems to have much less thought put into it. When an enemy detects Snake, the game enters a slow-motion bullet time that offers a second chance to neutralize the guard before an alert phase officially triggers. This seems pretty out of place as far as Metal Gear mechanics go, and it lacks any sort of depth. It's just a get-out-of-jail-free card. Reflex mode has a knock-on effect too. There's absolutely no penalty for using it in side ops or anything that isn't ranked. If a player is feeling particularly lazy, they can stroll through the base, triggering the mode over and over again, eliminating any need to even be remotely stealthy. In a Kojima Productions podcast, it was explained that the reason for including Reflex mode was that the team didn't want players to feel cheated or frustrated from being spotted from behind. They go on to say that previous entries in the series were linear and carefully balanced around where Snake would be facing and the direction he came from, so it was never an issue up until the Phantom Pain. While it's true that 360-degree awareness is a skill that wasn't really utilized in the old games, getting spotted is still the player's fault provided they have the means to prevent it. If the development team felt that Snake needed another tool to help balance the open-world stealth, then that's fine, but there needs to be consideration on how such a mechanic can be interesting. A system similar to Reflex mode, but more fleshed out and engaging, can be found in MGS2. If a lone guard in that game spots Raiden, it counts as an alert, but other guards won't arrive until they know something is wrong. The solitary soldier can use his personal radio to call in reinforcements, but shooting the radio or neutralizing the guard before that happens prevents the situation from escalating. I'm not saying the devs should have gone with the MGS2 approach, but it goes to show that Kojima's team is certainly capable of creative and interesting solutions, more so than Reflex Mode's current implementation. At the very least, it can be disabled, and going through a mission without triggering Reflex Mode awards bonus points. After retrieving Miller, the Skull's parasite unit makes its first appearance. Initially, they seem to be slow, unsettling zombies with erratic movements, but when they detect Snake, they quickly come to life, materializing their weapons out of thin air and leaping around at incredible speed. Part of what makes the Skulls so intimidating is that there is 4 of them working as a team to begin with, a large contrast to Snake Eater, where Big Boss only fought superhuman opponents one at a time. On my first playthrough, I actually managed to avoid detection by carefully drawing them away from the bridge, but most players will probably flee the Skulls on horseback rather than fighting them the first time. Since this is likely the case, I'll wait until their second appearance to talk about the group as a boss fight. Once Snake and Miller reach the chopper, they return to their base in the Seychelles to rebuild their army anew. Like the old MSF, Diamond Dogs has its own mother base, but it's a physical location as opposed to being purely menu-based like in Peace Walker. Using Fulton recovery balloons on soldiers and buying more platforms feels rewarding, because the base eventually reaches a colossal size. Mother base staff members will acknowledge the boss and even have conversations with one another, but in terms of actual base activities, there's barely any content at all. Most buildings don't let Snake into the interior, and main characters like Miller and Ocelot are nowhere to be seen and thus can't be interacted with. Having a place to bond with the soldiers Snake recruits, like a shooting gallery or a mess hall or anything really, would go a long way towards making the base really feel alive. Another one of Mother Base's main issues is its relationship with the Aerial Command Center, the chopper Snake uses to go on missions. For some reason, all the important menu management that can't be done in the field, like customizing weapons or the helicopter, can only be done in the ACC, eliminating another potential reason players might want to return to base. I'm not sure what the point of having the chopper as an intermediary is, since having 2 bases feels redundant. Venom is encouraged to return to base often, but the only tangible benefits to doing so are raising staff morale, usually through sparring, and showering, which actually does improve his combat capability. I probably don't need to highlight how ridiculous it is that the main reason Snake goes back to Diamond Dog's headquarters is to beat up his comrades and take a shower, but I will anyway. During the first trip to Mother Base, Miller expresses his frustrations over losing his comrades and limbs, hating Cypher ever since. But during his impassioned speech, Venom barely responds at all, staring vacantly the whole time. During the hospital attack, it can be expected that Snake would be too dazed to really hold a conversation, but 2 weeks later, when reunited with one of his best friends, he has almost nothing to say. The entire conversation is completely bizarre and awkward, with little indication of how Snake feels about everything that's transpired, but there's one moment that's striking. Before Miller is wheeled away, Venom rejects Miller's notions of revenge, shaking his head and stating that their fight is for the future rather than the past. Kojima isn't known for being subtle, and in the case of MGS5, it seems as though Venom is supposed to be obsessed with vengeance. Snake's nickname is Ahab, he's helped by a man named Ishmael, and his choppers are known as Pequod and Queequeg. These are all heavy-handed allusions to Moby Dick, a story focused around the fanatical Captain Ahab and how his obsession with revenge became self-destructive. If by some miracle you don't know about the tale, the white whale Moby Dick chewed Ahab's leg off, so he obtains a prosthesis made out of whalebone, much like how Snake uses a prosthetic hand. When Ahab encounters Moby Dick again, his desire for revenge becomes overwhelming, causing him to act recklessly. In the end, Ahab loses not only his chance at revenge, but his life as well. For someone who goes by that name to reject Miller's idea of vengeance is incredibly strange. It only serves to make things more confusing. The next few missions highlight one of the problems with the open world. Many of the game's main operations have little to nothing to do with the main story. After saving Miller, Venom's next 3 jobs are the following. Eliminate a Spetsnaz detachment commander, destroy Soviet communications equipment, and extract an engineer who attempted to defect from the Soviets. In no way do any of these relate to Cypher or Skullface. It's reasonable that without a lead on the main villain, Snake would take on various jobs to expand Diamond Dogs, but a large number of the main ops don't have self-contained stories either. There are some notable exceptions, but on average, the only difference between a main story mission and a side op is simply that the story mission is ranked and has optional tasks, like picking up diamonds or extracting prisoners. Episode 6 tasks Snake with recovering a US weapon called the Honeybee before the Soviets can acquire it, but it's also the mission where the main story resumes. You can figure this out in under 10 seconds because every mission has a moronic credit roll that tells the player exactly which characters are going to appear before Snake is even on the ground. Other than going for a TV show aesthetic, I have no idea why this is in the game. I hate being spoiled, but even for players who don't mind that aspect, the credits can still pose a problem. If the player is told in advance that there's only enemy troops without any major characters, then that mission can seem like filler content or padding compared to the relatively few story missions. If foreshadowing is a subtle warning of things to come, then the credits sequence is the opposite, with the only advantage being a slight visual flair. The mission itself features some interesting areas. The mountain relay base surrounds a large bridge, with alternate paths taking Snake around or below it. The main fort itself is a sprawling open area with plenty to explore, and the Honeybee itself lies hidden within the caverns in the rear. After retrieving the weapon, Venom finally encounters Skullface for the first time. I'm quite fond of this cutscene's visuals and sound design. In particular, Snake staring down the villain while being held upside down by the mechanical arm makes for an iconic scene, but everything else makes little sense. James Horan does an excellent job voicing Skullface. Every word out of his mouth seems sinister, but the dialogue itself doesn't communicate much of anything. As usual, Venom is silent, and all Skullface says is that Snake might get a glimpse of what's really going on if he's able to stay alive.
Well, I'm sure you'll see the bigger picture, eventually. If you get out of here alive.
He then releases Venom, leaving him to fend for himself against the Skulls, but this seems completely out of character for Skullface based on his previous actions. In Ground Zeroes, he implanted Paz with 2 bombs to be absolutely sure that Big Boss would die, and the only reason Snake survived is that Paz happened to wake up in time to fling herself off the helicopter. In the hospital at the beginning of the Phantom Pain, Skullface's XOF forces systematically combed the entire building and killed every single person they could find just to be sure Big Boss was dead. From this perspective, it's difficult to believe that Skullface wouldn't just crush Venom to death with his giant mechanical hand after finally cornering him. His last lines to Venom are "Rest in peace this time, and I'll see you in hell," but if he really wanted Snake dead, he had the perfect opportunity. Maybe it makes more sense in Japanese, but as is, the scene feels sort of aimless.
Rest in peace this time.
To make things even more confusing, the Parasite unit showcases its power to transform regular people into zombies. Correct me if I missed something, but I don't think it's ever explained why they can't just do that to Snake too. The Skulls function as the typical Metal Gear Solid boss unit, but they're easily the least interesting one in the entire series. Members of the unit are essentially drones with no personality, and despite their incredible abilities, the fights themselves tend to be about as dull as their character. The Skulls in Episode 6 are the same type as the ones from Miller's Rescue, so if Snake fought them back then, the fight is simply a repeat. These Skulls have 2 attacks, standing still to fire at Snake or attempting a machete strike that can be easily countered. That's the entire fight, there's nothing else to it. The Skulls' defining characteristics, incredible agility and ability to create mist, barely influence their moveset at all, since the mist hardly impairs Snake's vision and their speed is mainly used for jumping around in between bursts of fire. If they didn't convert soldiers into zombies, it could be argued that their superpowers are unnecessary, since their attacks are barely different from that of a random guard to begin with. Furthermore, the Skulls don't seem to function like a true unit at all. Each member just randomly attacks Venom whenever they feel like it. When Miller first described how the Skulls quickly decimated his unit under the cover of mist, I instinctively thought of a section from Metal Gear Rising. One of the game's bosses, Monsoon, will throw smoke grenades at Raiden's feet and rapidly assault him from every angle. The player needs to pay close attention to Raiden's surroundings in order to block from the correct direction, or Monsoon can quickly overwhelm him. This one-off section of a boss fight does a far better job incorporating a haze into the gameplay than the Parasite unit, and it's not even Monsoon's main gimmick. Ultimately, the Mist unit simply isn't an engaging boss fight, and without their own sense of identity, it becomes difficult not to see the Skulls as anything more than slightly tougher grunts. As the player progresses further into the game, it becomes harder and harder to ignore the sheer amount of time wasted because of the helicopter. At the beginning of almost every mission, Snake sits around while the credits play out and expository dialogue is relayed to him, and it's all completely unskippable. Since it's not a mask for a loading screen, it all seems completely unnecessary, too. Snake could easily start on the ground and have relevant information explained during actual gameplay, so why bother taking control away from the player in the first place? The other issue with the helicopter is its exceptionally long dispatch time before arriving at a landing zone. This can be mitigated with engine upgrades and calling for the chopper in advance, but even still, a sizable chunk of time is inevitably lost waiting for Pequod to show up. It seems as if the development team was aware of the issue, since landing sites have conveniently placed flora to collect in the meantime, but this is a stopgap measure more than anything else. Downtime is the enemy of fun, so it's difficult to justify the chopper's current implementation when the time spent playing Pensive Passenger Simulator could be put to better use actually playing the game. The next boss fight pits Venom against the sniper known as Quiet, the same woman who attacked him in the hospital. There's not much to say about her character in this initial confrontation, since she attacks him the second she's able to. The fight is somewhat of a Metal Gear standard, a sniper duel taking place across an enormous environment, but in many respects it seems like a watered-down version of the fight against the End in MGS3. Quiet benefits from being able to turn invisible and move extremely quickly, yet despite all of this she is ridiculously easy to track. While she takes time to line up a shot, a laser sight and white indicator on the screen reveal the exact direction she's firing from. In addition, her constant humming makes locating her with the microphone equally simple. Out of all the boss fights in the Phantom Pain, I would argue that Quiet's is the most affected by the changes to Snake's vitality. Venom quickly regenerates health when he hasn't sustained damage for a few seconds, and Quiet only fires one shot at a time. Since one bullet can't kill Snake from full health, the only punishment for tanking hits is having to briefly get behind cover. When the player is allowed unlimited mistakes, as long as there's a couple seconds in between each one, it makes Quiet seem much less threatening, especially since other snipers in the series deal damage that can only be healed with items. The ruins are designed in such a way that Snake can always sneak right behind Quiet, but the only advantage to doing so is the chance to melee her. By comparison, sneaking up behind the End offered the opportunity to hold him up, scoring special dialogue and a unique set of camouflage.
I don't think so. Fine. Have this.
Quiet's fight isn't awful, but it fails to capitalize on what made the End such a fan favorite. Firstly, because he blends into the terrain and doesn't broadcast his location using the player's UI, the End is much more difficult to locate. This combined with 3's more methodical stealth system makes for a much longer encounter, and the time between each individual confrontation only adds to the tension. Whereas Quiet's attacks are barely punishing at all, each tranquilizer dart the End manages to stick Snake with has to be removed in the cure menu. Furthermore, the stamina each hit drains needs to be replenished by eating, and if Snake came into the fight low on food beforehand, he may even need to hunt for more while still engaged in the boss battle. This sort of thing may not appeal to everyone like it does to me, but it's unique and lends itself extremely well to a battle of attrition. These aspects, along with tons of little touches, like being able to capture his parrot, or the 2 different ways to avoid the fight entirely, solidify the End as one of the most memorable bosses in the series. It feels like a genuine battle of subterfuge, with both sides trying to stay concealed.
I have no regrets.
Unfortunately, Quiet's fight just doesn't live up to him. There's fewer ways to interact with her, she's too easy to locate, and all the cover littered around the area encourages a bland whack-a-mole style engagement. With barely any resource management and no need for stealth, Quiet's boss battle is just a normal shootout that serves to highlight how regenerating health can sometimes remove all tension from an encounter. On a final note, her health bar doesn't make much sense. Historically, depleting a boss's red health counts as a kill for scoring purposes, while draining the stamina bar doesn't. Strangely enough, defeating Quiet through lethal means doesn't count as a kill. The choice to execute her occurs after the fight regardless of what method Snake uses, so there's no meaningful distinction between her health and stamina, they're the same thing. After the encounter, Ocelot and Miller begin to argue over whether Snake should bring Quiet in for interrogation or simply finish her off. This is the first of many times the 2 advisors come into conflict while trying to influence Venom, but there's almost never a reason to side with Miller. He's extremely prejudiced when it comes to Cypher and comes across as someone who makes irrational decisions based on his emotions. If Snake decides not to kill Quiet, Miller immediately disregards his decision and tells him that he's gonna have her assassinated anyway, making him seem untrustworthy.
Boss, you know I've always got your back. But if you bring her here, I'll just have her killed.
Ocelot, on the other hand, was never affiliated with the original Mother Base, making him far more impartial. In one of the strategy guide excerpts, Kojima states that different players will have varying feelings on revenge. Those who played Peace Walker or Ground Zeroes will be more likely to want retribution than someone who's new to the series. He goes on to say that Miller's role is to serve as motivation for revenge, the idea being that even someone who never interacted with Mother Base before will want to get even for his sake. But I think for many players, Miller's lust for revenge can be more off-putting than persuasive. In the case of Quiet, though, neither advisor really influenced my choice much at all. Instead, I decided to spare her because I was curious as to what she'd do next. Killing her didn't seem like a good option if it might deprive me of future content. I'm probably not alone in thinking about the choice from this perspective, and it just goes to show that gameplay advantages can often supersede other factors, devaluing a decision as a whole. If Quiet is extracted, she ends up saving Venom's life during the return trip to Mother Base. When the two of them arrive, Miller and Ocelot resume arguing about whether or not to kill her until Snake intervenes. At the end of the cutscene, Snake ominously states that since she knows the location of Diamond Dog's headquarters, he's prepared to kill her himself when it becomes necessary. Going back to gameplay, one of the Phantom Pain's new features is the addition of buddies, companions that travel with Venom on his operations. Each of them is a unique set of abilities and customizable gear that can be developed as Diamond Dogs grows ever larger, as well as a relationship level. Building a buddy's relationship unlocks more commands for them to use and improves some of their baseline abilities. D-Horse, the first buddy, is available immediately after the prologue. As one might expect from a horse, D-Horse's main uses are transportation and pooping to make enemy vehicles spin out of control. Next, despite the name, D-Dog is actually a wolf that Snake happens to find in the Afghan wilderness as a puppy. As time passes and he reaches adulthood, he becomes a valuable addition to Diamond Dogs and my personal favorite buddy. It's clear that Kojima and his team put a lot of effort into his animations and the way he behaves. Didi's probably the best looking and behaving dog I've ever seen in a video game. He has the ability to sense nearby enemies and plants by default, but I'm of the opinion that this is completely overpowered, especially for how early in the game Snake can use it. The location of all nearby enemies is one of the most useful pieces of information a player can have in a stealth game, so it needs to be carefully balanced. Normal marking of enemies is relatively fair. There's a time cost to use it, there's room for mistakes, and Snake needs to have seen a guard beforehand to reap the benefit. Didi blows all of this out of the water by marking all enemies in range instantly, eliminating the need for recon or planning altogether. The only downside to tracking is that it wears off if the duo goes out of range of the marked enemy, but that's hardly an issue when the range is so enormous to begin with. It's also sort of jarring that Didi can give Snake a real-time map of every person in the area that even distinguishes enemies from prisoners just by barking a few times. I think there's some room for creativity in how this could have been adjusted in the early game. Maybe at low relationship levels, Didi could only track 1 or 2 targets, or act like Snake's sonar arm and be able to find targets without displaying exactly what or who they are. As time goes on, the R&D team could design him a little system where 1 bark registers his target as friendly or neutral and 2 barks means enemies. Or they could have someone on the intel team whose entire job it is to listen to him bark and translate that info onto the map. I'm sorry, this is getting off topic. It's just really funny to think about how something like this can even work. The next buddy is, of course, D-Quiet. Once she's finally available to deploy on missions, she functions as a sniper, but her movement and camouflage powers also enable her to scout out bases independently of Snake. Like D-Dog's tracking ability, this is pretty powerful, but it's limited to predetermined areas that Snake picks from a menu. Early on, it's difficult to use Quiet for stealth missions because her starting rifle is lethal and non-silenced, but as soon as she obtains a silent weapon, she's able to clear entire camps by herself. Out of all the companions Venom can bring with him, Quiet is most affected by changes to the relationship meter. As it fills, she becomes far more affable towards him, yet it's sort of strange that her entire personality can change over the course of a few hours of gameplay. D-Walker is different from the other buddies in that it is a soulless machine and thus doesn't have a relationship bar at all. It's purely dependent on R&D in terms of usefulness, and the player can have different configurations for both stealth and combat. There's not much more to say about D-Walker except for that the aforementioned lack of relationship gives him much less of an incentive to use over other buddies for most of the game. After several more jobs, Diamond Dogs receives a transmission from none other than Huey Emmerich, asking for help defecting from Skullface's forces. Miller suspects him of enabling XOF to destroy the previous Mother Base, so it's seen as an opportunity to get some of the answers that have remained a mystery for 9 years. Venom finds Huey in the same hangar as the new Metal Gear Sahelanthropus, and a cutscene plays. Huey is sent flying down some stairs like in Peace Walker, and of course, he pisses his pants in classic Metal Gear fashion. What's interesting is the way Skullface perceives Huey. Skullface has done some really horrendous things in order to realize his goals. Putting a bomb in someone's vagina is pretty much as bad as it gets, yet despite all of this he thinks Huey is still unfit to judge him. It's an incredibly suspicious turn of events.
I refuse to be judged by your standards, traitor.
The Soviet base camp Huey's located at is fairly large and detailed, but there's no real reason to explore any of it when interrogating the base's first guard reveals the doctor's exact location. Once Snake reaches the lab, a short cutscene ensues where, interestingly, both the mammal pod from Peace Walker and Huey both have trouble recognizing Venom. Afterward, the player has the option of using a walker gear to exfiltrate the base. The machine certainly moves quickly, but the trade-off is it's much easier to spot than Venom by himself. As soon as Snake and Huey are about to escape the area, Metal Gear Sahelanthropus slams into the ground like a meteor. Instead of a traditional boss fight, Snake's objective is to evade detection until he and Emmerich can safely board the chopper. I'd say it's nice to have a stealthy sort of encounter for a change, but the fight just amounts to shooting rocket pods while hiding behind rocks. It's really not as exciting as being chased by a Metal Gear should be. There's a nice little touch at the end of the mission. Up until this point in the game, players have been conditioned to think that they're safe once they've boarded the helicopter. This makes it much more frightening when Sahelanthropus leaps after the chopper and forces Snake to shoot it down. Back on Mother Base, Huey is tortured until he reveals that Cypher is interested in pursuing new weapons research in Africa, the second and final open-world area. After spending so much time in Afghanistan, many players will be wanting a change of scenery, but there's already a huge problem with pacing up to this point. There are 50 main missions in total, and Africa opens up after mission 12. Despite being so early into the game, Snake has explored all but one of the major bases in Afghanistan. There's almost nothing left to see in the entire zone. Right before Chapter 13, Ocelot contacts Venom out of the blue to tell him that Zero from MGS3 is bedridden and wasn't actually responsible for the destruction of MSF 9 years prior. He goes on to say that with the Major out of the picture, Diamond Dog's true enemy is Skullface and his rogue faction, which doesn't truly represent Zero's Cypher. This is a fairly significant revelation for both Snake and Miller since both knew him in the past, yet the player doesn't get to see a reaction or any sort of emotional response about it from either character. This isn't the only example of important character information being glossed over, though. The worst offender is probably the tape about Chico and his sister Amanda. The two of them have a fairly significant role in Peace Walker, but Chico in particular is noteworthy because he's the first child soldier that Big Boss ever recruits. Also, after being tortured by Skullface and Ground Zeroes, Chico gave up critical information that aided in the destruction of the old Mother Base. The only time Chico and Amanda are brought up in the Phantom Pain is in a 50-second tape stating that Amanda succeeded in a revolution while Chico died in the helicopter crash that sent Venom into a coma. Basically, the game said, "What about Chico? Oh yeah, he's dead." Miller and Venom exchanged somber words about how his death was tragic and that there is only Mark on the world, but given the brevity of the tape, it hardly feels like Chico gets as much discussion as he should. On a side note, I'm not particularly fond of the kid, but I think Kojima might have missed out by not giving him a place in the Phantom Pain story. Since Chico is partially responsible for the destruction of Mother Base, he would have been a perfect target for Miller's ire, but he also fits in well with the theme of revenge and how it relates to the children that appear later on. It's easy to imagine that Chico would want retribution since both he and the girl he had feelings for are direct victims of Skullface's brutality. Apparently, this was on the table at some point since there's some concept art of adult Chico from the newly released MGS5 art book. There's no real point in speculating about why he's not in the game, but there's no doubt his abrupt disappearance from the series could have been handled better than it was. The first mission in Africa tasks Snake with shutting down an oil facility that's leaking crude into a nearby river. Out of all the missions in the entire game, this one is unique because it has two different kinds of objectives. Infiltrate the facility to turn off the pump and blow up the separator tank. This doesn't sound like much at first glance, but the interesting part is that structuring a mission like this forces the player to think about how to accomplish their goal. Blowing up the tank will obviously alert the entire base, so it makes sense to sneak into the control room and turn the pump off first or use some C4 to control the detonation. If the player wants to avoid killing anyone in the blast, they also have to consider how to handle the unit guarding the tank. Even if only a little, having a situation where the consequences of one objective can affect the other adds a layer of decision making. I really would have liked to see the team experiment more with this kind of thing. This introduction to Africa led me to believe that the objectives would continue to become more complex and interesting, but I was horribly wrong. The missions after the oil facility are as follows. Extract the prisoner. Extract or destroy some walker gears. Extract a truck. Extract 2 prisoners. Kill or extract a guy and then extract some child soldiers. Extract or eliminate some guy with information. You get the idea. Almost every single mission is some variation of extracting or destroying a person or vehicle. Some of the outliers, like the missions where Snake races against the Soviets to find a film canister, are really interesting, but sadly they're few and far between. The Phantom Pain's next boss pits Venom against an armored variant of the Skulls with the ability to manipulate explosive rock. Snake isn't required to defeat them in the first encounter, but he is later on, so I may as well cover them now. Their new earth powers are used to both hurl pillars of rock and create traps that blow up after a short time, but other than that, they act much like the Skulls from before, standing still to shoot at Snake or coming in close for a melee attack. They also have one more power that makes them my least favorite enemy in the game. They'll periodically add a shield to their health bar to become even more of a bullet sponge than before. I honestly think their new rock attacks might have made them an easier opponent than if they didn't have them at all, since they're slow, easy to dodge, and leave the Skulls extremely vulnerable. Their most threatening attack is still just standing still and shooting, since it's fast and relatively accurate compared to anything else they can do. Expanding their moveset makes them less likely to shoot, making damage easier to avoid on the whole. I'm not trying to say that difficulty should be the biggest factor with all of this, but rather it seems counterintuitive that these new supernatural attacks are less of a problem than their guns. While I appreciate that the Armored Skulls actually do use their powers in an interesting way compared to the first type of skull, their new abilities don't add any more depth or require the player to use a different strategy than before. The past few missions have had hints as to what's going on behind the scenes, but the main story picks up again when Snake receives a job offer to kill soldiers taken prisoner inside a mine before they can talk. Upon arrival, he discovers that the prisoners are all children and decides to rescue them after faking their deaths. Escort missions in video games are rarely fun, but this one's pretty short, and I like how after the enemy discovers the children are missing, they begin to send reinforcements from behind Snake, forcing the player to watch 2 directions. Once the kids reach the base, Miller and Snake decide to give them a basic education in the hopes they can have a chance at a normal life instead of becoming soldiers. After learning that Shabani, the children's leader, is still missing, Snake makes his way to a place called the Devil's House. The building is the site of horrific experimentation, and while Snake is able to locate Shabani inside, he also finds Skullface. Shabani is killed shortly afterwards, and then the Man on Fire makes his return. Like in the prologue, the Man on Fire is completely invincible to normal weapons, so this is more of a puzzle than a boss fight. I assume most players found a way to escape him pretty quickly, but it's interesting to note that there are several alternate ways in which he can be defeated. Destroying one of the numerous water tanks in the area while the Man on Fire is near buys enough time to get on the chopper, but it also leaves Psycho Mantis vulnerable to gunfire or a supply drop that can end the fight outright. There's also a spare jeep that can be used to ram him off the cliff, and knocking him into a pool of water will prevent him from reforming too. These all feel like nice Metal Gear touches, but no matter the strategy, the section simply boils down to luring the Man on Fire to one spot and incapacitating him. None of the methods are really all that different from one another. In the next major mission, Venom needs to dismantle a group of militant children by extracting their leader known as the White Mamba. This is the first mission to introduce child soldiers as an active enemy, with the stipulation that if any die, the mission is automatically a failure. The concept of kids as soldiers is pretty integral to the series, so I'm glad they finally became an obstacle that the player can't ignore. The children's leader, Eli, attacks Venom on sight, leading to a boss fight. It's short and it's easy, but that's to be expected. Snake is a trained soldier fighting a kid. I really like the way Eli fights, the guerrilla hit-and-run tactics he uses, and the way he'll leverage any object in the environment to strike back makes him seem pretty clever. But in the end, Snake easily defeats him and drags him back to Diamond Dogs. The second Eli gets off the helicopter, he immediately grabs Snake's knife, only to be humiliated for the second time. Based on his name, his looks, and his attitude, he's very obviously Liquid Snake as a kid, and as the story progresses, he becomes a major catalyst for events that happen later on. When it comes to side ops in the Phantom Pain, I can't help but feel that it's an overwhelming grind fest with barely anything interesting to do. For every mission I enjoyed, like capturing a rare bird, there's dozens more that are the exact same tedious objective, like eliminate the tank unit, or eliminate the armored vehicle unit. The game doesn't even try to hide it. You're going down a checklist where there's literally 20 missions that are so interchangeable that there's not even a reason to give them distinct names. The only difference between Prisoner Extraction 12 and Prisoner Extraction 20 is the location. In terms of other things to do that make use of the open world, I figured that animal collecting might be fun since I enjoyed those side missions the most and had a lot of fun messing around with the fauna and Snake Eater, but I had absolutely no idea what I was in for. Larger animals like goats, bears, and jackals function just fine, but the system behind capturing smaller prey is insanely stupid. For these creatures, Snake has to travel to the general area that they inhabit and put down a bunch of cages hoping that the right animal will find its way in. You don't go back to pick them up either. To even see what's inside, Snake has to leave the area entirely. The only indication they even exist is that Ocelot shows you a picture of what they look like and the fact that some of them show up on the animal conservation platform. For all Snake knows, Ocelot could just be fucking with him and making him plant empty cages as a joke. I legitimately don't understand how anyone could think animal collection would be a good idea when the animals don't actually exist in the game and can't be interacted with. It's such a bizarre problem that I strongly get the impression that much of the animal system was cut content. There's no way to know for sure, but in one of the gameplay previews, Mother Base had extracted animals roaming around the main structures, something that's not possible in the final product. At a certain point in the game, Diamond Dogs is hit with a deadly outbreak, and in order to prevent a huge number of base personnel from dying, Venom is tasked with quarantining the staff before they can develop symptoms. The game forces the player to look at a list of soldiers who are already quarantined, but beyond that, any actions taken are the responsibility of the player, which is fine. An attentive player will remember that many tapes were playing in the Devil's House in different languages, but there's one trick to help those who may not have noticed. When viewing the advanced details of staff members, the only new information that's presented is a list of the languages each person speaks, so the answer has to be found there. Sure enough, all the members already quarantined have a language in common, Kikongo, so the player has enough information to figure it out even if they weren't already aware of the infection's relationship with language. Hunting down clues as to how to save the infected on Mother Base leads Snake to seek out an old man called Code Talker in one of the best missions in the game. Early on in the valley, the final variation of the skulls appears, a group of snipers. Their attack patterns are similar to Quiet, and they move to different locations every time they're hit, like she does, so the main difference between the two bosses is quantity. It's a bit more difficult to safely shoot one of the skulls when they're watching multiple angles, and cover is much scarcer than in the ruins, but other than that, the fights are quite similar. Regenerating health is still a big issue here. Just like with Quiet, there's no punishment for repeatedly tanking hits as long as they're spaced out appropriately. In my first playthrough, rather than confront the skulls head-on, I opted to sneak past them by climbing up the cliffside near the waterfall. I like this route more than actually fighting the snipers. The path around them is pretty scenic, and sneaking past an open area of snipers just seems more fitting to me conceptually. The sprawling mansion holding Code Talker is one of the only large interiors in the game, which is a shame considering how fun it is to sneak through. There's plenty of ways to enter the building, and multiple floors allows for vertical exploration, but again, this is at odds with a timer that encourages doing things as quickly as possible. Code Talker is a wise, elderly Navajo biologist who is confined to the Candle Basement. Upon meeting Snake, he shares his peace pipe and explains that the infection is caused by weaponized vocal cord parasites that trigger when words of a target language are spoken. Upon leaving the basement, I discovered that since I ignored the sniper skulls in the valley, they turned all guards into zombies and set up new positions along the route to the extraction point, which is a really nice touch. On the ride back home, the chopper is suddenly ambushed and the mission ends, allowing Snake to pick a more combat-oriented loadout before the boss fight. This kind of thing would have been helpful during the mission to extract the truck, since the same kind of skulls pop out without warning. It's kind of a strange situation, though, since you can avoid fighting them, but that probably won't happen without the Fulton upgrades to extract vehicles. Maybe it's because the prior missions can be won without defeating the skulls, Or maybe it's because the player can simply hop over a wall to trigger the fight without having to play any other part of the level, but no one's going to know that on their first attempt. It feels inconsistent to have one fight against armored skulls without warning and another one with it. I guess it's not entirely correct to say there's zero warning since the opening credits give it away, but without ever having fought the armored skulls before or being aware that they will actively try to destroy the truck, trying to formulate a working strategy to avoid fighting them seems a bit unrealistic on the first attempt. The second encounter with these kinds of skulls is much the same as the first. Their shields are still annoying, and Snake will likely spend a decent chunk of time hiding to regenerate health if he doesn't fight from the rooftop. It's pretty strange that Snake fights both the armored skull units at the same place, but hey, at least each group prefers a different side of Nova Braga Airport, I guess. Once Code Talker is safe, he explains that Skullface's plan is to sell Metal Gears with nuclear strike capabilities that can be remotely disabled, making it seem as though tons of groups can use their own nukes at any time. Once the Dine reaches Mother Base, he stops the vocal cord parasite outbreak, while Ocelot tortures Huey for Sahelanthropus' location. Armed with this information, Venom immediately travels back to Afghanistan to infiltrate Skullface's base and find the Metal Gear. OKB-0 is one of the best, if not the best area in the entire game. It has tons of paths, 3 separate smaller sections to sneak through, and is absolutely crawling with guards. Just like Code Talker's mansion, the level uses vertical layers to great effect. Many of the guards stand on scaffolding, and the ruins surrounding the base often lead to higher ground. So at any given time, the player needs to watch for enemies at a few different elevations. Once Venom makes it to the end, he finally encounters Skullface again, but his personal guard is also there, so he just gives up for the time being. While Snake accompanies the group, Skullface segues into an elaborate speech about his goals. One of the first things he states is that he and XOF worked as Big Boss's cleanup crew all the way back in Snake Eater, which is really goddamn stupid. The whole point of Fox as a unit was to send in one single soldier without any equipment that might identify them to minimize the chances of sparking an international incident. So sending in an entire second team after the first guy doesn't make any sense. It also makes the logistics behind Snake Eater a lot more ridiculous since it clearly wasn't made with this revelation in mind. Did Zero just radio Skullface whenever he was done talking to Snake and repeat everything he just said? The whole thing is even more puzzling because both the CIA and the boss never knew about XOF to begin with. Skullface may as well not have participated in Snake Eater for all the difference it makes to the story. Furthermore, why would Skullface ever care about the correct interpretation of the will of a person he has never met or interacted with? Big Boss and Zero both have had a history with her, looked up to her, and feel betrayed by the American government since they sent her on a suicide mission. But again, none of that applies to Skullface. I'm not at all convinced that claiming he was in Snake Eater was a good idea or even necessary. His own past gives him enough motivation for his actions as is. Skullface goes on to talk about how he lost his native language at a young age and his plan to unify the world through exterminating English and nuclear proliferation. After he's finished, the game's flagship song, Sins of the Father, starts playing while Venom and Skullface awkwardly stare at each other for several minutes. Remember that Snake hasn't said a word during this entire rant, and at one point he even looks at the camera as if to say, "Is this guy serious?" The entire scene is so incredibly jarring and awful that I pretty much refuse to believe Kojima doesn't know how bad it is. I have to wonder if the problems plaguing him and his team because of Konami are responsible in some way, because I simply don't understand how this came to exist. Upon reaching the Metal Gear hangar, the Man on Fire is poised to attack Venom when suddenly Eli hijacks Psycho Mantis and has the fiery foe run over instead. Skullface says the funny line, and then Sahelanthropus starts wreaking havoc. As far as Metal Gear fights go, Sahelanthropus is pretty standard. There's a few different vehicles Venom can use as siege weapons, but personally I think their controls are pretty cumbersome. If you're like me and went through the whole game only using them once or twice, then it's difficult to learn how to handle them decently during a boss fight. I suspect for many people it wasn't worth the trouble. On a strange note, every time Snake hits a weak point hard enough, someone calls in to congratulate him. I don't think they intended for this to be as hilarious as it is.
You never cease to amaze, boss. Nice work. Keep it up. Nice work. Keep it up.
But it definitely highlights the boss's overabundance of weak spots. It's It's honestly difficult not to hit one if Snake uses any kind of explosive weapon. Compared to every other boss in the game, though, Sahelanthropus has a refreshingly large moveset. I can't overstate how much better this feels compared to fights like the Skulls, where Snake has seen everything they can do within 30 seconds of starting the encounter. Once Snake brings the Colossus down, he and Miller finally get their revenge on the vulnerable Skullface, yet they refuse to actually finish him off. As the two of them begin to walk away, Huey takes the gun they tossed aside and kills Skullface himself, cheering in victory. This is a fairly disturbing moment. It's downright bizarre to hear Christopher Randolph's voice celebrate someone's death. I'm sure many players felt underwhelmed after Skullface's abrupt end, especially given how little Venom interacts with him, but these kinds of feelings are the point. Kojima has stated that he wanted to use the Phantom Pain to explore what happens after the object of someone's vengeance is gone. Not having a boss fight for Skullface was certainly deliberate. I think taking this kind of artistic liberty is fine, but I'd argue that it doesn't pay off in the end, for reasons I'll get into soon. Back at Diamond Dog's HQ, Sahelanthropus being carried onto the base, as well as visions of Skullface, make it abundantly clear that things are far from resolved. At this point, the credits rolled, and I sat there wondering if there wasn't more until a trailer for the game's second chapter played. Chapter 2 is beyond a shadow of a doubt the strangest part of the game. The vast majority of its missions fall into two categories: prior missions with special conditions to make them more difficult, and new tasks that have nothing to do with how the plot advances. I like the different hard modes for old missions. I wish every major mission had them, and I feel like they make some of the game's boss battles better, but they're poorly implemented. They aren't new content, and they don't pertain to the current story, so listing these repeats sequentially as main missions make the game seem like it's padding itself out. It's even more confusing because the hard mode missions are completely optional for completing the main story, but the game never tells this to anyone. If someone can progress through the story by doing random side ops instead, then by what definition are the hard mode's main missions at all? Being based on something that was a main mission? I don't know. As far as the new missions go, there's not much to say, but I'll reiterate that I enjoyed the film canister search and wish the game had a lot more variety in its objectives. Depressingly, aside from the extremely few new missions, Chapter 2 just doesn't have anything original to offer in terms of gameplay. No new bosses, and no new areas to sneak through. From here on out, this analysis is going to be mostly story-based, since honestly there's just not much left in the game other than story. Going back to it, an off-screen accident kills one of the kids in the base, and Eli shows up as if to say he's responsible. Sometime after, there's another mysterious accident. This time a ruptured chlorine tank. Eli seems to be the culprit once more, but the rest of the kids are distressed because Shabani's necklace fell down near the tank. Instead of waiting for the leak to be fixed, Quiet retrieves the necklace herself, suffering severe burns in the process. It's mildly touching that she's willing to go to such lengths for the kids, but it still seems stupid to me that she doesn't just wait for a qualified team to handle it. It's just a necklace. It can wait. Eventually, Miller becomes curious about the mammal pod from Peace Walker and sends Snake to retrieve it from Huey's lab. Shockingly, he finds the corpse of Strangelove inside. Huey comes up with several excuses for how she could have ended up in there, but it's interesting to note that in Strangelove's recording from inside the pod itself, she specifically asks Huey to let her out, strongly implying he was at least present while she was locked in. When it comes to light that Quiet possesses a strain of the vocal cord parasite, Miller tortures her for information, which ends up being a gigantic waste of everyone's time until at the very end, Code Talker discovers that she speaks Navajo and possesses the last English strain. At some point, Venom discovers the location of the Man on Fire's corpse, but he comes back to life during Fulton extraction, somehow summoning his magic unicorn without the help of Psycho Mantis. Back in MGS2, a similar event happened with Fortune. Kojima seems to like it when supernatural things happen even after the catalyst for them is gone. It's been apparent for a while that the Man on Fire is Colonel Volgin, but he anticlimactically goes back to being a corpse after pinning Snake to the ground. There's an important reason for this, but having Volgin's arc end so abruptly without any more gameplay doesn't feel satisfying. This may well be intentional like with Skullface, but again, there's been very little in terms of interesting gameplay in Chapter 2. The story has progressed almost exclusively through cutscenes. Once Eli is ready, he finally sets his plans into motion by sending the mother-based children back to their old homes to take care of any business they may have left. This triggers an annoying fetch quest to find all of them. It's reminiscent of Zadornov and Peace Walker and how stupid some of these kids' locations are. Seriously, what are you even doing up here? Once they're all brought back, one of the most baffling cutscenes in the entire game plays. With Mantis' help, Eli and the kids steal Sahelanthropus in one of the choppers, then fly away across the ocean, never to be seen again. No one even looks or acts surprised that any of this happens, they just grimly stare at the Metal Gear while Miller calmly states that Eli must have been planning the escape all along. Next up in the list of Mother Base crisis situations is another outbreak of the vocal cord parasite killing the staff despite the Wolbachia treatment. Snake decides to visit the quarantine facility himself to learn more. When it becomes apparent that the parasite urges the infected to get outside in order to spread, Venom is put in a difficult position. To spare his men the pain of being burned alive as well as prevent a global threat, Snake takes it upon himself to give each of the infected a quick death. There's quite a few techniques at play to make the situation as unsettling as possible. Huey constantly screams at Snake, many of the soldiers beg for their lives, and there's even a group of men that salute their leader as they await execution. Venom finds one soldier that appears to be clean, but as he makes it back to the entrance, it becomes apparent that he's infected too. This is one of the only times in Chapter 2 Venom gets to participate in the story in a way that matters, and while it's a much better way to advance the plot than simply showing a cutscene of Venom doing all of this, there's no traditional ranking or difficulty at all. This section has two main issues that dampen some of the emotional impact. First off, the player isn't allowed to bring any of their loadouts with them. Snake is only given a lethal weapon. For me, this was a dead giveaway that everything would end in a slaughter from the beginning. I don't see any reason that it needed to be set up like this. The soldiers carry plenty of their own weapons and ammunition, and if non-lethal weapons aren't sufficient, then there's no harm in choosing to bring them along anyway. The second problem is much larger than the first. It's difficult for a player to feel guilty for killing soldiers they have little to no attachment to. Much earlier I talked about one of the issues with Mother Base is that there's no way to bond with the staff besides beating them up. I imagine for some players this creates an awkward situation. Oh yeah, I remember you. I threw you to the ground and tossed empty magazines at your head. What a shame. This is made worse by the fact that since this is near the end of the game, the sheer number of soldiers Snake has Fultoned by at this point can make them feel disposable. This section would be vastly improved with more opportunities to connect with the individual soldiers. Losing people you know has a greater impact than losing interchangeable staff members. The Quarantine Massacre and the funeral succeeding it both illustrate just how deeply Venom cares for his men. The incident isn't his fault, yet understandably, he still feels guilty and wants to preserve the memory of his comrades. In the aftermath of the incident, it comes to light that Huey both caused the mutation and contacted a company with links to Cypher in order to defect from Diamond Dogs. Given his constant lies about other issues, such as Strangelove's death or the relationship he had with his son, Miller finally gets fed up and calls for a trial. Things quickly devolve into anarchy, with seemingly everyone demanding Huey's head, but despite the lies and the dead men Huey leaves in his wake, Venom chooses to exile him instead. To continue with the trend of everything going wrong, Quiet decides to let herself be captured by the Soviets. Code Talker quickly explains that she holds one of the English strains of the parasite, that the quarantine incident made her realize she could still pose a threat even if she never speaks, and that she refused Wolbachia treatment because some part of her still wanted revenge against Venom. Since Quiet is conceptually built around conveying information without speaking, I think Code Talker verbally telling the player all of her feelings and motivations detracts from her character. Maybe I'm being nitpicky, but like the announcement that Major Zero is bedridden, this is another one of those frustrating situations where critically important character information is revealed without any chance for a dialogue about it. When one of the Soviet soldiers attempts to rape Quiet, she quickly turns on them and teams up with Snake to destroy waves of reinforcements. I don't find the mission's gameplay all that interesting. It's tedious to shoot vehicles, get supply drops, and then rinse and repeat a bunch of times. Once it's finally over, Quiet is knocked unconscious, and then Venom the Snake bites Venom Snake while the two are hiding from the enemy. With no other options, Quiet speaks English in order to save his life. When V comes to, Quiet is gone for good, leaving behind only a tape in which she thanks Snake for their time together. The Phantom Pain's final mission is a special case, so I'll give my thoughts on the second part of the game before delving into it. On the whole, Chapter 2 seems like a skeletal structure rather than a fully fleshed out part of the game. Tons of people have criticized it for being an unfinished mess, and that's probably pretty close to the truth. I think there's two main reasons for this. The first is that quite simply there is tons of cut content that should have been in but isn't. The most glaring example is obviously when Eli and the other Mother Base kids fly off into the sunset with Sahelanthropus. There's bonus footage that reveals that Venom is supposed to chase after them, leading to an entirely new island section where Diamond Dogs wages war with Eli and the remnants of XOF. And at the end of it all, Snake finally settles the score with Eli, yet none of this made it into the Phantom Pain. Having Eli be such a critical part of the game and then omitting the end of his entire arc is just unacceptable. This is a character who's responsible for usurping Skullface's Metal Gear and leaving him for dead, who is the last strain of the English parasite, and who carries out his plans well into the future of the series. The battle gear Huey develops is another feature mysteriously absent, and it's a real shame because an open-world Metal Gear is the perfect opportunity to let players rampage about with their own super weapon. It's pretty ridiculous how much the game builds up to it too, since there's multiple cutscenes from planning to production of the battle gear that the team left in, even though no one will ever see it in action. There's plenty of other assorted features and cutscenes that never made it into the final game, like a return to Camp Omega or a breakdown Snake has in Africa. The final product just feels hollow somehow. I'm sure some of that is the intended Phantom Pain, but it seems to go far beyond that. The other major issue with this chapter is that the few new missions Venom has are completely divorced from the plot. Chapter 1 had Skullface as the antagonist, but with him gone, Diamond Dog's conflict turns inward. Kaz is paranoid about spies and begins a 1984 Big Brother campaign of fear to root them out, while Eli and the kids on the base begin making threats of their own. Tensions are high on the base, and yet Snake simply goes through his normal routine in Afghanistan and Africa, doing odd jobs completely unrelated to any of this. Pretty much the only time Snake participates in the chapter's story are in the quarantine and quiet missions. It's frustrating to see Venom aimlessly wander around until he's done enough missions to see the plot advance. I understand it's much harder to craft gameplay around the internal conflict of the base, but any semblance of direction has gone out the window at this point. Speaking of a lack of structure, the game's last mission abruptly appears in the menu without any warning. There's no transition or anything before it to suggest that the Phantom Pain is nearing its end. The beginning cutscene manages to reveal the game's central twist through two different methods. The credits ruin the surprise once more, but it's less of an issue this time around since immediately after, one of the surgeons does the same thing through one of his lines. After the cutscene, this quote appears. This is stupid for this mission because the plot twist can only exist as a fact. Regardless of anyone's perception, it either did or did not occur. At this point, the player is forced to go through the entire prologue once again, and unfortunately the gameplay is completely unchanged. Several details in the story are different than in the original prologue, proving that Venom has an unreliable account of what really transpired. After the ambulance crash, the player finally learns what happened to Ishmael. At last, the Phantom Pain states in no uncertain terms that Ishmael is the actual Big Boss, while Venom is a decoy meant to draw the attention of anyone who'd want Big Boss dead. In the next scene, Venom finally remembers who he truly is, the medic who was on the helicopter with Big Boss during Ground Zeroes. Due to hypnotherapy and plastic surgery that took place during his coma, Venom truly believed he was the legendary soldier, complete with all the memories needed to make himself as convincing as possible. What comes next is my interpretation of the story's overall meaning. I know how easy it is for someone to sound pretentious or like they're trying to find more meaning than there actually is. I hope I don't come across that way, but I also think there's a fairly sizable misconception people have about the ending. Also, the Phantom Pain is a pretty confusing narrative with an unreliable main character, so don't automatically assume I'm completely right either. Out of all the Metal Gear Solid titles, the Phantom Pain is most similar in story structure to MGS2. I say this mainly because Venom, Snake, and Raiden are both meant to be avatars for the player. Kojima uses both of them to create a meta-narrative in which the player is a participant. Both games have a similar twist. The player expects to play as Solid Snake or Big Boss, but is given Raiden and Venom respectively. In the beginning of Raiden's adventure, the player is required to input a name that ends up appearing on a dog tag he wears. Like much of the player base, Raiden sees Solid Snake as a hero to aspire to, but it's only when Raiden stops trying to copy him and begins to focus on himself and his own past that he starts finding success. At the end of the game, he throws away the dog tag with the player's name, a symbolic gesture of freedom and proof that he's finally become his own person. Similar to MGS2, the Phantom Pain's prologue has the player enter a name and birth date, but it goes even further by giving the players the opportunity to choose how the medic actually looks as well. Rather than a story of Big Boss's descent into madness and villainy, the Phantom Pain is a story about the player and their experience as Big Boss's fake. Venom Snake is largely a blank slate to allow the player to project their own personality. He barely speaks at all in the entire game, but despite this, his actions reveal some defining characteristics of his own. He values his comrades above all else, seeing them as his family. When forced to kill his own men in the quarantine facility, he's completely devastated. It's likely he will always feel guilt for what he had to do. In addition, Venom seems to have no interest in revenge at all. He rejects the idea when Miller first brings it up and takes no pleasure in torturing Skullface in his final moments. He shows mercy to Huey, which is pretty saintly by itself, and he takes in displaced children when he doesn't have to. What I'm getting at with all of this is even if the player goes on their own revenge-fueled killing spree, Venom is portrayed as a reasonably merciful person who's able to be compassionate towards anyone. He was a medic before everything that transpired, so I guess it makes sense that he'd want to prevent the loss of life whenever possible. In the ending, once Venom remembers who he once was, he listens to a cassette tape in which the real Big Boss congratulates him. I've seen a lot of people write that the player becoming their own Big Boss is supposed to be some sort of empowering triumph, a title well earned for their commitment and service, proof that anyone can be a hero, but I think this is a hilariously wrong interpretation of the ending. Throughout the Phantom Pain, I got the impression that the game would often make fun of the player for their title.
Amazing. Mission complete. That right there is why you're the best, boss. The one and only.
Wow, only you, the legendary Big Boss, could have done such a great job. People are gonna tell stories about how amazing you are. The actual message on the cassette tape is full of contradictions. It's so egregious that it really does seem like doublethink. You've written your own history. You're your own person. I'm Big Boss, and you are too. He's the two of us together. I am you, and you are me. If there's one constant in Metal Gear, it's that there's only room for one boss and one snake. This is even the boss's dying words, so this speech is complete nonsense.
There's only room for one boss and one snake.
Venom nods and smiles while hearing all this. It doesn't make any sense, especially since he holds Big Boss's memories and should know better, but something about it all sounds reassuring. When the tape is turned over and there's a lapse in time, the emblem on the wall shows Outer Heaven instead of Diamond Dogs. In the mirror, Venom no longer sees his true identity, but the bloody visage of Big Boss instead. Finally realizing what's happened, he smashes the mirror and turns his back on the man who betrayed both Venom Snake and the player. Like the US government did to the boss, Big Boss basically erased a good person's identity and legacy so that history will never know the role that they played. One of the main arguments I've seen against Big Boss's actions being a betrayal is that the medic is so loyal that he'd be willing to make the sacrifices to protect him. Ocelot even states this in a tape, but I don't see how anyone can say Venom would absolutely agree to have his identity erased and replaced with that of Big Boss. He was in a coma. It's not like anyone could ask him if he was okay with it. And the preparations for everything began while he was still unconscious. The other point of contention is that the entire idea was one of Major Zero's schemes. It's true, but you can't really say Big Boss is innocent either. He helps Venom escape the hospital, but after that he never bothered to inform him of everything that transpired and just continued to use him. Like Skullface, Venom had his face and identity stolen from him. Just as Skullface never had a choice in what happened to him, Big Boss never allowed the medic to choose for himself. Despite Venom's role as a hero who saved the world from Skullface and contained the parasite outbreak, he would later be killed by Solid Snake. Big Boss's transition into a villain was shown through the way he treats the medic, rather than as a story where you play as him. As is Metal Gear Solid tradition, there's an important conversation after the credits. Ocelot reveals to Miller that Big Boss went into hiding to work on his own Outer Heaven, leaving the two of them to support the Phantom until he's ready. At this point, Kaz has finally had enough and decides to keep supporting the Phantom and the clones in the hopes one of them will overthrow his old friend. Things take a turn for the stupid when Ocelot decides that since there's only room for one son, he and Miller should each support a different clone, and since that makes them enemies, there's also only room for one Miller or Ocelot. This whole conversation is so incredibly retarded, I can't even begin to wrap my head around it. If Ocelot's main motivation is to help Big Boss, then why on earth does he care about aiding the clones at all? I know Miller and Ocelot don't exactly like each other, but paraphrasing, the conversation is basically this. There will be a huge power struggle in the future between these children we vaguely know. We must each pick a different side, and one of us will die during the war between them. Jesus Christ, what? I can't ever imagine this as something a human being would come up with as a rational thought. It's completely absurd. A good twist should recontextualize the rest of the story, but that doesn't really happen in the Phantom Pain. The game foreshadows Venom isn't Big Boss to the point where I think it's far too obvious. and there's only 2 instances where I felt the ruse was used to its full potential. The first is a mission in which Diamond Dogs is invaded by a rival private military force. If Snake manages to capture their leader, Mosquito, then Miller is able to interrogate him for more information. A rumor had Mosquito convinced that Big Boss planned the attack 9 years ago himself, that he sold out his fellow soldiers to go into hiding. If the player is aware that Venom is a fake, then there's some great dramatic irony here. Mosquito may be wrong about the attack, but he's completely right about the kind of person Big Boss has become. The side quest involving Paz is also well executed. When Snake first finds her room on Mother Base, Ocelot mentions that she has dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder, but Venom is actually the one experiencing these. Once Snake obtains all the pictures from the Peace Walker soldiers, it's revealed that Paz is a hallucination brought on by the medic's guilt for being unable to save her in Ground Zeroes. Characters in this game keep saying that their phantom pain will go on forever and that they'll never heal emotionally to the point where it gets annoying, but this actually explores Snake longing for something he can never get back. Despite how sad it is that Venom is still racked by guilt, Paz's last tape is fairly uplifting. To bring him closure, she says that as long as Venom continues to remember her, she'll live on as part of him. Since none of this is real and he's basically just talking to himself, this is probably the idea Venom uses to get by. Like with Shabani's necklace or making the ashes of his fallen soldiers into diamonds, the medic tries to preserve everyone by keeping the memory of them alive. Unfortunately, no one does the same thing for him in the end. Another issue is that the twist doesn't seem all that essential. Suppose the real Big Boss were the protagonist instead of Venom. Aside from the ending, the narrative would barely need to be changed at all. It could have easily been Big Boss who took down Skullface. Compare this to MGS2. If Solid Snake continued to be the protagonist instead of Raiden, then the entire story would need to be rewritten. It simply couldn't function. The Phantom Pain's twist is still important because it reveals what kind of person Big Boss has become, but it has no impact on the vast majority of the plot. Each Metal Gear Solid title contains a central theme that the game revolves around. For MGS1, the theme is Gene. For MGS2, it's Meme, etc. On Twitter, Kojima stated that the Phantom Pain actually has 2 themes, race and revenge. Despite all of the Moby Dick allusions, I don't think the self-destructive nature of Revenge or Skullface's chain of retaliation is as relevant as Kojima might have intended. Venom outright rejects the idea of revenge as his motivation, but is doomed anyway because of Big Boss. Huey happily takes revenge on Skullface, but his exile happens because of the things he did while trying to defect from Diamond Dogs. Miller is probably the most zealous about getting payback for what happened, yet in the end he and Code Talker have a tape conversation in which they both admit they went too far and learned a valuable lesson. Volgin was after vengeance, but sought out the wrong person the whole time, so he gave up. Quiet refusing Walbakia treatment because of revenge leads to her sacrifice, so that one works well enough. Eli wanted revenge more than anyone else, but his story is unfinished, so that just leaves Skullface. The charismatic villain definitely wanted payback for all the horrible things he experienced, yet that isn't really responsible for his downfall. In the end, he was just unlucky that Venom unintentionally took control of Mantis away from him by finding the angriest kid in all of Africa. Once Skullface is killed, Diamond Dog's conflict becomes internal, but even then Miller realizes he's being paranoid and stops before things really get out of control. Revenge is a motivator for almost every character, but it rarely seems to negatively impact them in a significant way. Kojima defines the second theme, race, as the misunderstanding, prejudice, hatred, and conflict caused by a difference of language, race, customs, culture, and preference. This applies more to Quiet than anyone else. Her silence and tendency to use violence to communicate puts everyone on edge to the point where Miller is constantly trying to get rid of her. The biggest problem with this theme is that it has almost nothing to do with the primary conflict between Diamond Dogs and XOF. Snake's gripe with Skullface has nothing to do with culture, and everything to do with the fact that he tried to have Venom assassinated, intends to unleash a biological weapon, and encourages nuclear proliferation. There's not really any racial tension as a result of skin color or language either. Kaz theorized that the parasite was being used as an ethnic cleanser, but that ended up being false, since Skullface flat out states he wants to exterminate English so that Zero couldn't use it to exert control over the world. I wonder if Kojima's idea of race is one of those things that doesn't translate to English very well. It's pretty difficult to see how it applies. This last bit is pure speculation, but it's interesting to note that long before the Phantom Pain's release, Kojima mentioned that his next game would challenge a taboo that could cause him to leave the games industry if mishandled. There's nothing in-game that even remotely comes close to that sort of criteria, but it seems as though the game's story may have been massively changed during development. In an interview in the weekly Famitsu, a man named Kenji Yano claims that in 2011, Kojima told him about the Phantom Pain structure, only it was quite different than the game that released in 2015. The old story saw Huey as Ishmael and Diamond Dogs as an enemy of America itself rather than Skullface's renegade group. Huey would tell the story from America's perspective, one that sees Diamond Dogs as a group of murderers, and Diamond Dogs would have their own reasons for making an enemy of America. If what Yano says is true, then the Phantom Pain was effectively a game where the player manages a terrorist group that wants to destroy America. I wonder if this idea was the taboo Kojima was referring to. It certainly seems like the kind of thing that could receive massive backlash, and it's a much more morally ambiguous story than what was released. Again, this is all speculation though. The reality is we'll likely never know what went on during development, especially given the tension between Konami and the development team. This finally concludes the Phantom Pain, but it's also the end of the Metal Gear Solid series under Kojima for good. I can't say I expected it to end with Big Boss directly betraying the player, but I have a feeling Kojima was never interested in telling a straightforward story of a hero falling from grace to begin with. Ultimately, I think the Phantom Pain had the potential to be the best game in the series by far, but mediocre boss fights, pacing issues, cut content, and the game's entire second chapter hold it back. I wonder what sort of impact Konami had on the game due to its gross mistreatment of the development team, but there's no way to know for sure. All anyone can do is look at the Phantom Pain as it exists now. Changing the formula by making the last game in the series open world was a bold move. I'm not sure it succeeded, but I can respect that the team chose to try something new. The fact that Kojima wanted the fans' last experience with the series to give them a Phantom Pain is a little morbid, but, like Venom, the Metal Gear Solid saga will live on as long as people remember it.